Today's story reveals three heartbreaking cases of young women whose promising futures were tragically stolen. First, the murder of Vanessa Guillen, a soldier at Fort Hood, sparked outrage and changed the conversation about harassment and violence within the military. Then, the tragic story of Samantha Josephson, whose mistaken rideshare ended in an unimaginable loss, leading to important safety reform. Finally, the mysterious disappearance and murder of Mackenzie Lueck shows the devastating consequences of misplaced trust. But before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload daily, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. The morning sun began to rise over Fort Hood, casting a soft light on the vast expanse of one of the United States' largest military bases. Soldiers hurried to their morning duties, rifles slung over shoulders, uniforms pressed and ready. The base was alive, a machine running with practiced efficiency, a place where young men and women came to dedicate their lives to their country. Among these soldiers was Specialist Vanessa Guillen, a young woman with a fierce dedication to her family and country. That morning, she went about her duties, a familiar face on the base, known by many as quiet but driven, a woman of few words but filled with ambition. But somewhere on this sprawling military installation, something felt wrong, like the strange calm before a storm. Vanessa had been scheduled to meet her supervisor, collect equipment, and then head back to continue her duties. But that morning, just as quickly as she appeared, she seemed to vanish. When hours went by without any sign of her, her friends on base grew concerned. It wasn't like Vanessa to disappear without a word. She was reliable, her dedication unshakable. Calls went out to her phone, but there was no answer, only the silence on the other end. A search was launched almost immediately by her friends and fellow soldiers. They scoured the barracks, the training grounds, the mess hall, every corner of the base where Vanessa might be found, but there was nothing, no trace of her. As the hours turned to days, the situation grew tense. Her family was alerted and drove to the base from Houston, their minds racing, heartbeats quickening as they arrived, only to find more questions than answers. Her mother, Gloria, was relentless, demanding answers from the military officials who assured her that everything possible was being done to locate her daughter. But as the days dragged on, the reality of Vanessa's disappearance hit hard. Rumors began to swirl, whispers in darkened hallways of things that were never spoken of, a dark undertone that contrasted sharply with the loyalty and pride woven into Fort Hood's legacy. Yet, even with her family's relentless questions and demands, there was a chilling silence, a reluctance to face what might have happened. Vanessa's younger sisters, Lupe and Mayra, stood by their mother, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, knowing that the person they looked up to, who had been their strength, was gone. They clung to every word spoken by officials, hoping for some hint, some crack in the official statements that might reveal a clue. But nothing came. No one could explain where she had gone, why she would vanish in broad daylight from one of the most heavily secured places in the country. But outside Fort Hood's gates, the story of Vanessa's disappearance had taken on a life of its own. The Guillen family, desperate for answers, turned to the public, their voices cracking with pain as they begged for help to find their daughter. Social media erupted in support. The story of Vanessa's disappearance was shared thousands of times, as people across the country joined in, hoping for her safe return. Yet, as each day passed without word, the fear and anger grew. People began to ask questions, not just about Vanessa, but about the environment on the base. What had happened that day? How could a young soldier simply vanish, with no witnesses, no trail to follow? Inside Fort Hood, questions about Vanessa's disappearance continued to simmer under a surface of tension. The whispers grew louder, with everyone wondering the same thing. How could a soldier disappear on duty on base? Vanessa's mother, Gloria, persisted in her pursuit of answers, relentless and unyielding, no longer willing to accept vague explanations. Each conversation with officials ended in the same frustrating way, leaving Gloria and her family with no more clarity than before. Meanwhile, outside the base's walls, public support for Vanessa's family continued to rise, reaching people far beyond Texas. The hashtag #FinVanessaGuillen became a rallying cry, drawing attention to her case and fueling outrage across the country. The more the family fought for answers, the more people took notice, recognizing in their battle something deeply unsettling, something that went beyond Vanessa alone. The family's frustration resonated, their pleas for justice amplified by voices who demanded the truth, whatever that truth might be. Under this intense pressure, the military finally opened an investigation into her disappearance, claiming they were doing everything in their power to find her. Investigators combed through evidence, analyzing security footage, retracing Vanessa's steps, speaking to anyone who might have seen her that morning. But despite their assurances, Vanessa's family felt they were getting nowhere. Each passing day, without new information, felt like an eternity, and each new dead end in the investigation only deepened the mystery and despair. Then, an investigator came forward with new information that sent shockwaves through Vanessa's family and supporters. It was a lead, a small one, but it offered a thread of hope. They had found a witness, someone who'd seen Vanessa that morning, who reported she had entered an arms room on base. But after that, there was no record, no trace of her exit, no explanation of why she had been there. This small detail raised even more questions. Why was Vanessa in that particular room? Who else was there? As the family pressed for more, the investigation took on an even darker tone. A name surfaced, a fellow soldier, someone who may have been the last person to see Vanessa alive. He was a young man, quiet and unassuming, but his behavior had caught the attention of investigators. He became the focus of their scrutiny, a figure around whom details began to swirl. Vanessa's family clung to every piece of information, every new development, watching as the truth began to emerge in fragments, like shards of broken glass. The weight of each revelation bore down on them as they waited, hoping that somehow this nightmare would end and that Vanessa would be brought home. But deep down, they knew something terrible had happened. With the growing media attention, the base could no longer contain the scrutiny. The public wanted answers, and the family's heartbreaking story fueled a firestorm that demanded accountability. People across the country watched and waited, united in the same hope and fear. And as the investigation moved forward, what it uncovered would prove to be beyond anything the family, or the public, had imagined. 4-0. As investigators continued to follow every lead and explore each darkened corner of Fort Hood, a grim sense of unease settled over the base. Every soldier, every officer, knew that something sinister lay hidden, and that Vanessa's disappearance had exposed the cracks in the foundation of the place they called home. It was then that the investigation took an unexpected and horrifying turn. Vanessa's family received word that a set of remains had been found near the base, partially hidden along a desolate riverbank. The discovery sent shockwaves through Vanessa's family, and the weight of this grim possibility bore down on each of them. They arrived at the site, their hearts pounding, clinging to the small, desperate hope that these remains were not Vanessa's, that their daughter, sister, loved one was still out there somewhere. But as the forensics team began their work, identifying the remains, those hopes were dashed. The confirmation came swiftly, almost too swiftly. The remains were Vanessa's. The realization hit her family with the force of a storm, as they stood by, silent and grieving, their worst fears confirmed. This was no accident, no tragic misfortune, it was something far darker. Then the investigation zeroed in on the soldier whom witnesses had reported seeing Vanessa with on the day she disappeared. His behavior had been erratic, suspicious even, but now, under the weight of this evidence, the details surrounding his actions took on a new meaning. Investigators pressed him for answers, tracing his movements on the day Vanessa vanished, piecing together fragments of a story that none of them wanted to believe. And just when it seemed like they were on the verge of a breakthrough, the soldier's story took a dark, unexpected twist. He too was found deceased. With this chilling revelation, the investigation grew even more complex, as authorities began to unravel the tangled web of events leading up to Vanessa's final moments. The horrific nature of what they uncovered exposed the terrible truth of the dangers that Vanessa had faced in her final days, the fear and uncertainty she had carried silently as she performed her duties. What had happened on that fateful day at Fort Hood went far beyond any isolated incident. Back at home, Vanessa's family fought to find peace with the reality they now faced. Her mother, her sisters, and the community that had rallied so fiercely behind her felt the depth of the tragedy in every word, every shared memory, every rallying cry for justice. This was not just about Vanessa anymore. This was about every woman who had ever felt unsafe, every soldier who had ever felt unseen. As the world turned its eyes on Fort Hood, demanding change, demanding accountability, Vanessa's legacy began to take shape, not in silence, but in strength. The world outside Fort Hood erupted with outrage as the truth of Vanessa Guillen's final days came to light. The public demand for accountability grew deafening, amplified by the voices of those who had long suspected that the military's promises of safety and honor were, for some, nothing more than hollow words. The #Vanessa Guillen movement surged, a digital storm that carried the stories of countless others who had experienced fear and injustice within the very institutions meant to protect them. Vanessa's family, despite their immense grief, stood at the center of this storm, their voices unshaken and resolute. Gloria Guillen, her heart broken, but her spirit unyielding, spoke with a fire that inspired millions. She called not only for justice for her daughter, but also for change, real, tangible change within the military. Standing beside her were Vanessa's sisters, Lupe and Mayra, who channeled their pain into a tireless fight for their sister's name to be remembered, for her legacy to mean something far greater than her loss. As rallies were held across the country, from Houston to Washington, D.C., the Guillen family became symbols of resilience and defiance. At each event, Vanessa's story was shared, not just as a tragedy, but as a call to action. People held candles, banners, and signs with her face, chanting her name, refusing to let her memory fade. They demanded answers, they demanded reform, and most of all, they demanded accountability from those who had failed her. Within the walls of Congress, the echoes of these demands began to reverberate. Lawmakers were forced to confront a harsh reality. Vanessa's case was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a systemic failure, one that had silenced too many voices and allowed too many injustices to go unchecked. The I Am Vanessa Guillen Act was introduced, a bill designed to overhaul the way the military handled reports of harassment and to ensure that no soldier would have to endure what Vanessa had faced. But this fight was not without resistance. Military officials, faced with a tidal wave of public criticism, scrambled to defend their actions, or lack thereof. Investigations were launched, protocols were questioned, and hearings were held. Yet for the Guillen family, it still felt like the truth was being dragged out slowly, piece by painful piece, as they were forced to relive their loss over and over again. Despite the bureaucratic obstacles, the movement only grew stronger. More survivors of mistreatment within the military came forward, emboldened by Vanessa's story and the growing public support. Their voices, though long silenced, now rang out alongside the Guillen families, creating an unstoppable wave of change. For Gloria, Mayra, and Lupa, every step forward was a bittersweet victory. They knew that no law, no reform, could ever bring Vanessa back. But as they stood in the midst of this monumental movement, surrounded by people who had been touched by Vanessa's courage and their own unwavering determination, they found a flicker of hope. Vanessa's life, though tragically cut short, was becoming a catalyst for something far greater. And yet, amidst the progress, there remained an unshakable void, a reminder of the young woman who had inspired it all. As the months passed, the momentum, sparked by Vanessa Guillen's story, showed no signs of slowing. Across the country, her name became synonymous with resilience and the fight for accountability. The Guillen family's pursuit of justice had transformed from a singular, heartbreaking tragedy into a nationwide call for systemic change. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers debated the provisions of the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act, spurred by the overwhelming public support and the unwavering determination of Vanessa's family. The bill promised to reshape the way harassment and abuse cases were handled within the military, offering protection to those who had too often been silenced. For many, it was a long overdue step forward, a chance to dismantle a system that had failed so many before Vanessa died. But the process was not without its struggles. Advocacy required relentless persistence, as political opposition and bureaucratic hurdles slowed progress. Gloria, Vanessa's mother, stood undeterred, her speeches filled with the same fiery conviction she had shown from the beginning. She reminded the world that this was not just about her daughter, it was about ensuring no other family would endure the pain she had experienced. As the act made its way through Congress, the changes it sought began to materialize, even before the ink was dry. New protocols were implemented across military bases, requiring increased oversight and accountability in the handling of reports. Whistleblowers who had once feared reprisal now had new avenues for speaking out, and training programs were rolled out to address the deeply ingrained culture of silence. These measures, though far from perfect, marked the beginning of a profound shift within the military. Meanwhile, the community around Fort Hood had also changed. Vanessa's story had forced a reckoning, not just within the military, but in the public consciousness as well. Vigils were held regularly at the gates of the base, where families and advocates gathered to remember Vanessa and push for continued reform. The base itself was not immune to scrutiny, with investigations uncovering further issues that demanded attention. Slowly, the foundations of secrecy and neglect began to crack under the weight of accountability. For Vanessa's family, these changes were a bittersweet triumph. They found solace in the legacy their daughter had left behind, but the void her absence left was inescapable. In the quiet moments, when the rallies were over and the headlines faded, they felt the full weight of their loss. Yet, even in their grief, they found strength in the outpouring of support from people around the world who had been touched by Vanessa's story. Vanessa's sisters, Lupe and Mayra, became tireless advocates, continuing the work their family had begun. They traveled across the country, sharing Vanessa's story with schools, communities, and organizations, ensuring that her name would never be forgotten. They spoke not just of her death, but of her life. The sister who had been their rock, the soldier who had dreamed of serving her country, the woman who had inspired a movement. As the Guillen family stood at the forefront of this fight, they saw the ripple effect of their efforts. Survivors who had once felt voiceless now found the courage to speak out, their stories adding to the growing tide of change. For every new voice, every new step forward, Vanessa's legacy grew stronger, a beacon of hope in a world that had failed her. In the end, Vanessa Guillen became more than a name, more than a face on a poster. She became a symbol of resilience, of justice, and of the power of a family's love to spark a revolution. And though the Guillen family would always carry the pain of their loss, they knew that Vanessa's light had not been extinguished. It burned brighter than ever, illuminating a path forward for those who had suffered in silence for far too long. And so her story continued, not as an ending, but as a beginning, a legacy that would inspire generations to come. The next story is called Rideshare Nightmare. The night of March 29, 2019, was supposed to be a celebration, a night of laughter and joy with friends. Samantha Josephson, a 21-year-old student with a bright future, was out with her friends, enjoying one of their final nights together before graduation. Columbia, South Carolina, was lively that night, the streets filled with students, laughter echoing from every corner as they danced and embraced the thrill of a carefree evening. But as the night wore on, the lively energy started to thin, and Samantha decided it was time to head home. She had her plan, like any cautious young person navigating a world where things don't always feel safe. She opened her phone, clicked her Uber app, and ordered her ride. She checked the make, model, and license plate, preparing herself with the care her parents had taught her. Her friends watched her as she drifted away from the bar, heading toward the waiting cars just outside, their headlights slicing through the darkened streets. She scanned the vehicles, looking for the one that would take her home. But in the flurry of cars, lights, and the low hum of music, Samantha missed a detail that would change everything. A black Chevrolet Impala was parked nearby, the kind of car that could easily blend into any street. It was dark, unassuming, and so familiar that she barely questioned it. As she approached, the driver remained silent, his face partially hidden. Maybe in her mind, the quietness of the moment was comforting, and the night felt safe. Without hesitation, she opened the back door and slipped inside. The streets rolled by, a blur of lights and shadows, but there was something in the air, a strange quietness that felt unsettling. Samantha tried to chat, but the driver was unresponsive, his face set in an emotionless stare as he looked ahead. She could feel a faint sense of discomfort creeping in, that primal instinct that whispers when something is wrong. But it was already too late. The car was moving, and the driver was not who she thought he was. Unbeknownst to Samantha, the man behind the wheel was Nathaniel Rowland. He had been circling the area, lying in wait, observing, hoping to find someone who might make the fatal mistake of confusing his car for the one they called for. He wasn't a stranger to the area. He knew the paths, the alleyways, the hidden turns. But he didn't know Samantha, didn't know her dreams, her family, her vibrant, compassionate nature. To him, she was merely an opportunity. As the car veered off the expected route, Samantha's concern turned to confusion, then fear. Her pulse quickened, and she glanced around, realizing the city lights had faded, replaced by a darker, more remote part of town. She tried to speak, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. Roland's response was cold, a mere glance in the rearview mirror, his eyes giving nothing away. Back in the heart of Colombia, her friends began to notice her absence. Messages went unanswered, calls went straight to voicemail. The night that had started with laughter and music grew heavy with worry. Soon, concern turned to panic, and the gravity of the situation sank in. Samantha was missing. As the hours passed, a search began. Samantha's friends notified the police. Her family was called, and within moments, the city knew something terrible had happened. Social media buzzed with her image, the face of a young woman whose bright smile seemed out of place in a world that could be so dark. Volunteers combed the streets, her classmates left messages, prayers went out for her safe return. But deep down, a gnawing fear had already taken root. It wasn't until later, miles away from where Samantha had last been seen, that her body was discovered. Found in a remote field, her life had been stolen, in a moment of cruel miscalculation. The discovery sent shockwaves through Colombia and beyond. Samantha Josephson's name was no longer just a name. It became a symbol of innocence lost, of the tragic consequences that can follow a single fateful mistake. In the days that followed, law enforcement threw all their resources into the investigation. They scoured security footage, analyzed cell phone data, and pulled together the pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to see completed. It didn't take long before Nathaniel Rowland's name surfaced, bringing a chilling clarity to what had once been a mystery. With the discovery of Samantha's body, Colombia's community was gripped by a chilling silence. Friends, family, and strangers alike were now bound together by shock and grief, their voices rising to demand answers. Law enforcement knew they needed to act quickly, to piece together the events that led to that tragic night. Soon, a team of seasoned investigators and forensic specialists were called in, determined to find justice for Samantha and bring whoever was responsible to face the consequences. Detectives combed through every possible lead, and it was only a matter of hours before a vital piece of evidence surfaced. Footage from security cameras showed Samantha approaching a car that resembled Roland's Chevrolet Impala outside the bar. In the video, the Impala stood like a shadow, waiting in silence, unnoticed by anyone around. It was enough to warrant a closer look at Roland, whose record revealed minor offenses but nothing that hinted at the violence that had unfolded. As they built their case, investigators tracked Roland's phone activity and reviewed surveillance footage, noting discrepancies that pointed toward his involvement. His cell phone records painted a path that matched Samantha's last known movements. It became clear that wherever she had been taken that night, Roland had been close by. With the evidence mounting, officers felt the net closing in, and on April 1st, just days after Samantha's body had been found, Nathaniel Rowland was brought into custody. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was tense. Rowland sat across from detectives, his expression guarded. He avoided eye contact, choosing to stare at a fixed point on the wall. Detectives leaned in, presenting him with a mounting pile of evidence, each piece a silent witness to what had happened. As they lay out the information, a hair sample, traces of blood found in his vehicle, witness statements, Roland's demeanor shifted. Yet, he held firm, offering vague responses that danced around the questions, never giving a direct answer. While Roland remained silent on his motives, the detectives pressed forward, collecting more evidence from his Impala. What they found was unsettling. Traces of blood, remnants of Samantha's belongings, all painting a picture of what had transpired that night. Forensic teams were meticulous, knowing that each tiny detail could serve as another brick in the wall of evidence against him. Even the smallest fiber, the faintest stain, took on new weight, each piece strengthening the narrative they would present in court. News of Roland's arrest spread quickly, and soon the public's demand for justice grew louder. Samantha's story became more than a case. It became a movement, a call for greater awareness and safety precautions for those who relied on rideshare services. Her friends and family took up the cause, rallying for changes that would prevent others from facing the same fate. As Nathaniel Rowland's arrest made headlines, the weight of the evidence began to reveal the grim details of Samantha's final moments. Investigators were relentless, piecing together a timeline that offered answers to the haunting questions surrounding her disappearance. The contents of Roland's vehicle became a chilling centerpiece in the investigation. Within the Impala, forensic specialists uncovered traces of Samantha's presence: her phone, a pair of shoes, and fragments of her clothing. Each item carried a story, one that painted Roland as the orchestrator of the tragedy. The bloodstains in the car told a tale of struggle and fear. Investigators meticulously analyzed the patterns, which spoke of an attack that was sudden and overwhelming. These findings, combined with the marks on Samantha's arms, suggested she had tried to protect herself, resisting with every ounce of strength she had. The car, once an ordinary vehicle, had transformed into a harrowing crime scene. But the most damning piece of evidence lay in Roland's behavior following the incident. Surveillance footage captured him attempting to sell items belonging to Samantha, including a set of her possessions discarded carelessly in a trash can near his residence. Witnesses later reported seeing him scrubbing his car with unusual vigor, as if trying to erase any trace of what had occurred. Despite his efforts, forensic teams found enough evidence to solidify his involvement. As the legal process began, Samantha's family sat through court hearings with heavy hearts, each detail cutting deeper into their grief. The prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had preyed upon the vulnerabilities of a young woman simply trying to get home. Roland's defense, however, attempted to cast doubt, suggesting alternative scenarios and questioning the chain of evidence. Yet, with each piece of forensic data and testimony, the narrative became clearer, leaving little room for doubt. Roland's actions in the aftermath spoke volumes about his intent. His movements were calculated, his attempts to cover his tracks deliberate. And as investigators testified about the blood evidence, the DNA match, and the items recovered from his car, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavier with the weight of the truth. Samantha's friends and family watched silently, their faces resolute, determined to see justice served. In the courtroom, the air was thick with tension as Roland's trial pressed on. The prosecution laid out each detail methodically, determined to ensure that the weight of the evidence against him would be unmistakable. Jurors listened intently as forensic experts took the stand, describing how Samantha's DNA was found in Roland's car, on the headrests, and on the handles. Each revelation was a stark reminder of the horror she had endured. The defense attempted to challenge these findings, raising questions about the validity of the forensic tests and the procedures followed. They tried to introduce doubt, hinting at potential errors in the evidence handling. But the prosecution countered each argument with unwavering precision, calling witness after witness who had examined the evidence carefully. Roland's behavior in the days following the incident was dissected, his movements mapped out in painful detail. Friends and family who had known Samantha well sat in silence, holding on to each other as the attorneys painted a picture of those last moments, the fear she must have felt. Roland, seated at the defense table, appeared composed, even detached at times. His expression remained neutral, as witness after witness recounted the steps investigators had taken to link him to the crime. But as the prosecutor spoke of Samantha's life, her dreams, and the people she had left behind, a somber silence fell over the room. This wasn't just another court case. It was the story of a promising life cut short, a tragedy that had shaken an entire community. Witnesses testified about the measures Roland had taken to evade capture, disposing of her belongings, attempting to clean the car, and continuing about his life as if nothing had happened. To the jury, it was clear that Roland's actions after that night spoke volumes. His calculated attempts to erase traces of the event revealed a chilling disregard for the person whose life he had taken. Finally, Samantha's parents took the stand, their voices steady but their hearts visibly burdened. They spoke not of the crime but of who Samantha was, a young woman with boundless potential, who had been deeply loved by those who knew her. Their words resonated with the jurors, adding an irreplaceable human weight to the facts that had been laid bare over the past weeks. The courtroom fell silent, every eye on the family who had lost so much, each person in that room feeling the depth of the loss as if it were their own. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the proceedings was palpable. Both sides delivered their closing arguments, the defense appealing for leniency, citing possible uncertainties in the evidence, while the prosecution urged the jury to consider the meticulousness of the investigation and the undeniable connection between Roland and Samantha's final moments. Each juror listened intently, their expressions reflecting the gravity of their responsibility. When the jury retired to deliberate, Samantha's family and friends waited in anxious silence, their faces a blend of grief and hope. Hours passed, each moment stretched by the anticipation of what Roland's fate might be. At last, the jury returned, their faces solemn, their verdict ready. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read the decision, guilty. The weight of the verdict settled over the room, a small measure of relief to those who had sought justice for Samantha. Roland remained impassive, showing little reaction to the words that sealed his fate, yet the impact was immediate and profound for those who had loved Samantha. Her family clung to each other, a bittersweet mixture of sorrow and closure washing over them. In the days that followed, Samantha's story continued to echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Her legacy spurred a movement that led to new safety measures for rideshare services, sparking a wave of awareness and precaution. Universities and communities rallied together, introducing programs and safeguards to help protect others from similar dangers. Samantha's name became synonymous with change, her life a call for action, her story a reminder of both the fragility of life and the power of community in the face of tragedy. The family, though forever changed, honored her memory by advocating for these new protections, transforming their grief into a force for good. And as they moved forward, their message remained clear. Samantha's light would continue to shine, her story resonating as a beacon of safety, remembrance, and resilience. The next and final story is called The Silent Goodbye. The warm, soft glow of Mackenzie Lueck's phone illuminated her face as she texted with practiced precision, her thumbs moving swiftly across the screen. She had just touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport after a trip to California for her grandmother's funeral. It was June 17, 2019, and while most people would have been exhausted from the emotional toll of such an event, Mackenzie seemed focused, deliberate. At 1:00 a.m., she ordered a Lyft to take her home, but as the car weaved through the quiet streets of the city, she gave the driver unexpected instructions to stop at Hatch Park, a secluded area in North Salt Lake. The night was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional hum of a passing car. Hatch Park, with its darkened pathways and shadowy trees, seemed an unusual place to be at such an hour. The Lyft driver later told police that Mackenzie didn't seem distressed. She sat calmly in the back seat, scrolling through her phone, a faint smile playing on her lips. When they arrived, she thanked him, stepped out into the cool night air, and walked toward a figure waiting under the faint glow of a street lamp. The driver didn't stay long enough to see what happened next. He had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. Mackenzie had gone to meet someone she clearly trusted, or at least someone she thought she could trust. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Mackenzie's disappearance didn't become a full-blown mystery immediately. At first, friends and family thought she might simply be lying low after her trip, processing the loss of her grandmother. But when texts went unanswered, calls went straight to voicemail, and she failed to show up for her classes at the University of Utah, concern began to spread. It was her friends who first sounded the alarm, reporting her missing on June 20. The police began their investigation by retracing her steps, piecing together a timeline that would lead them to Hatch Park. The Lyft driver was cooperative, quickly confirming that he had dropped her off there in the early hours of June 17. He mentioned the shadowy figure she had approached, but his description was vague, a tall man, dressed in dark clothing. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered something chilling. Mackenzie's social media activity hinted at connections she'd made on dating apps, including arrangements to meet people discreetly. Her digital trail painted a picture of someone adventurous but private, someone who sought excitement but maintained strict boundaries. It didn't take long for police to zero in on a potential lead, Ayula Ajayi, a tech-savvy man in his early 30s who had matched with Mackenzie on one of these apps. Ajayi lived just miles from Hatch Park, in a tidy suburban house that on the surface seemed unremarkable. But as detectives looked closer, they found cracks in the facade that hinted at something far darker. Neighbors had noticed strange activity around Ajayi's home in the days following Mackenzie's disappearance. The smell of burning lingered in the air as plumes of smoke rose from his backyard at odd hours. One neighbor recalled seeing Ajayi tending to a fire that blazed far longer and hotter than any typical backyard bonfire. It wasn't just the fire that raised eyebrows. Ajayi had been spotted scrubbing his car meticulously, spending hours cleaning every crevice. He seemed on edge, avoiding eye contact, and making hurried trips in and out of his house. The police had seen behavior like this before. It was the kind of nervous energy that often betrayed guilt. When detectives arrived at Ajayi's property with a search warrant, the idyllic suburban image he had cultivated began to crumble. In his backyard, they discovered a charred patch of ground, and buried beneath it, personal belongings that unmistakably belonged to Mackenzie. Among the ashes were pieces of her clothing, a belt, and other items too damaged to identify at first glance. Inside the house, investigators uncovered more evidence linking Ajayi to Mackenzie. Her texts, still saved on his phone, painted a grim picture of their brief interaction. But it was the discovery of a blood-stained mattress in the basement that solidified their suspicions. The forensic team worked tirelessly to process the evidence. Mackenzie's DNA matched samples taken from both the backyard and the basement, leaving no doubt that she had been at Ajayi's home. The police now faced the harrowing task of reconstructing the events of that night. Neighbors began coming forward with more stories, each more unsettling than the last. Ajayi had a history of erratic behavior and a fascination with fire. Years earlier, he had been accused of holding someone captive in his home, though charges were never filed. His demeanor in the days following Mackenzie's disappearance only reinforced the growing belief that he was capable of far worse than anyone had imagined. As the evidence mounted, so did the urgency to find Mackenzie's body. Her family clung to hope, desperate for answers, even as the possibility of her survival grew fainter. The search extended to Utah's vast wilderness, with teams scouring every inch of terrain near Ajayi's home. They were racing against time, knowing that every moment that passed made the trail colder. When the breakthrough finally came, it was both devastating and crucial. In a remote canyon nearly an hour's drive from Ajayi's home, searchers found human remains buried in a shallow grave. Dental records confirmed the worst. Mackenzie was gone. The discovery of her body marked a turning point in the investigation. Now, it wasn't just about piecing together what happened. It was about ensuring justice for Mackenzie and holding her killer accountable. Ajayi was arrested and charged with Mackenzie's murder. As his trial loomed, the public was gripped by the horrifying details that emerged, each one more haunting than the last. The crime had shaken Salt Lake City to its core, leaving an indelible scar on the community. The story of Mackenzie Lueck was far from over. The courtroom would become the stage for a battle to reveal the truth, a quest for justice that would expose the depths of one man's depravity and the enduring strength of a family determined to honor the memory of their beloved daughter. The investigation into Mackenzie Lueck's disappearance escalated rapidly after her remains were discovered in the remote canyon. Detectives now had undeniable proof that her life had been cut short, and every shred of evidence pointed back to Ayoola Ajayi. However, there was still so much they needed to uncover: the timeline, the motive, and the chilling details of what had transpired on that fateful night. Ajayi maintained his composure when confronted by the authorities, offering limited responses and denying any involvement. His calm demeanor unnerved the detectives, but his confidence began to falter under the weight of the growing evidence. As investigators pressed harder, the cracks in his story started to show. In the days following his arrest, police executed a second, more thorough search of Ajayi's home. The forensic team meticulously examined every corner, knowing that even the smallest detail could provide the missing pieces to the puzzle. What they found deepened the horror of the case. The basement was stark, cold, and sterile, a place that seemed designed to conceal secrets. Among the disturbing discoveries was a patch of carpet that had been recently replaced. Beneath the new layer, traces of blood were found, further tying the crime scene to Mackenzie. It was evident that Ajayi had gone to great lengths to clean up, but he had underestimated the precision of modern forensic technology. In addition to the blood evidence, investigators uncovered a series of unsettling items: a set of handcuffs, duct tape, and a variety of sharp tools. These items painted a picture of premeditation, suggesting that Ajayi had planned Mackenzie's death well in advance. Outside, the backyard became the focus of an extensive search. Digging deeper into the burned area where Mackenzie's belongings were found, investigators unearthed fragments of a notebook partially protected from the flames. Pages contained Ajayi's scrawled writings, disturbing and incoherent thoughts about control, power, and obsession. Each piece of evidence built the narrative further, and it became clear that this wasn't a crime of passion. It was something darker, an act fueled by a calculated and chilling intent. The next step was to unravel Ajayi's digital life. His devices were confiscated and examined, revealing a trove of incriminating information. Police found messages between him and Mackenzie that confirmed they had been in contact for weeks leading up to her disappearance. The conversations began innocently enough, but took a darker turn as Ajayi's tone grew more assertive and controlling. Detectives also discovered that Ajayi had conducted online searches for disposal methods and techniques to eliminate evidence, searches that had been made just days before Mackenzie vanished. He had even scouted locations around Utah for secluded areas, including the canyon where her remains were eventually found. As investigators pieced together this grim trail, they realized the level of planning that had gone into the crime. Ajayi's internet history showed a fixation on true crime cases and stories of infamous killers. He had studied how others had evaded capture, though his arrogance and inexperience ultimately betrayed him. While detectives focused on the hard evidence, they also turned their attention to Ajayi's past. Interviews with former acquaintances painted a picture of a man who presented one version of himself to the world, a successful, outgoing entrepreneur, while hiding a much darker persona. Former colleagues described him as manipulative, someone who thrived on control. Women who had interacted with Ajayi came forward with chilling stories of encounters where his charming exterior gave way to aggression when things didn't go his way. In one instance, a woman recounted how he had shown up uninvited at her home after she cut off communication, leaving her feeling unsafe and unnerved. Neighbors, too, had their own tales. Several recalled incidents where Ajayi had been seen pacing his backyard late at night, muttering to himself. One neighbor even reported hearing faint screams on the night of June 17th, though they had dismissed it at the time, thinking it was someone watching a movie. As more testimonies emerged, a disturbing pattern began to take shape. Ajayi's charm was a mask, hiding years of calculated and controlling behavior that had spiraled into something far more sinister. The culmination of these findings left detectives and prosecutors with a formidable case. The evidence against Ajayi was overwhelming, but what made the crime even more haunting was its senselessness. Mackenzie had done nothing to provoke her fate. She was simply in the wrong place, trusting the wrong person at the wrong time. As investigators continued to build their case, the public remained captivated by the story. News outlets delved into every available detail, painting a picture of a community both horrified and grieving. Mackenzie's friends and family, devastated by her loss, channeled their sorrow into raising awareness about online safety, hoping to prevent future tragedies. But even with a suspect in custody and a mountain of evidence, there was still one question that lingered in the minds of everyone following the case. What exactly happened to Mackenzie after she walked into the darkness of Hatch Park that night? As the case against Ayoola Ajayi grew stronger, detectives found themselves piecing together the final moments of Mackenzie Lueck's life with an unshakable sense of dread. Everything they'd uncovered, from the evidence at Ajayi's home to the hidden sides of his character, pointed to a terrifying escalation of his behavior. The haunting question still remained: what had actually taken place in the hours following her arrival at Hatch Park? The night of June 17, 2019, was when the carefully hidden mask of Ayoola Ajayi finally slipped. The arrangement he had made to meet Mackenzie in the isolated park wasn't spontaneous, it was calculated. Investigators suspected that he'd lured her there, intending to isolate her from the world she knew. But while he had meticulously planned each step, the intensity of what followed could not be planned for. Forensic evidence began to tell the story. DNA samples, trace evidence, and the items recovered from his backyard all pointed to a terrifying truth. The signs suggested a struggle, a final, desperate attempt by Mackenzie to escape. Neighbors close to Ajayi's property recalled hearing unusual sounds late at night, sounds they now regretted dismissing. In retrospect, the faint noises were haunting echoes of a tragedy unfolding. As more of Ajayi's life came under scrutiny, detectives identified a series of disturbing patterns. Ajayi had a history of using charm and manipulation to ensnare others, and his past was littered with strained relationships and warnings of aggression. He seemed to gravitate toward positions of power and control. In every sphere of his life, personal and professional, he had thrived on pushing boundaries and gaining the upper hand, regardless of the consequences. With a clearer understanding of his motives, detectives turned to Ajayi's documented online activities for more clues. His search history and digital trails revealed his fixation on high-profile cases and notorious criminals. It seemed as though he had meticulously researched ways to avoid detection, strategies used by infamous figures who had tried and failed to cover their tracks. Investigators were certain that he had drawn inspiration from these cases, thinking he could avoid their mistakes and remain unseen. As disturbing as the story was, there were still pieces missing. Detectives knew Mackenzie had been taken to Ajayi's home, and they could trace her last known activities, but they needed to connect every action that followed. Forensic experts were brought in to analyze the burned remnants of evidence found on his property, painstakingly piecing together clues from the ashes. Hidden beneath the scorched debris, they uncovered small remnants of Mackenzie's personal effects. The fact that he had destroyed these items in an attempt to erase her presence confirmed his intent and foresight. On June 28th, a breakthrough occurred. Police had previously questioned Ajayi multiple times, but this time, with mounting evidence against him, the interrogators were ready to press harder. He denied any involvement with Mackenzie's death, insisting that he was being wrongly accused. Yet, his responses grew inconsistent under pressure. Detectives noticed how he avoided direct eye contact and his slight hesitation when responding to specific questions. His composure was beginning to wane. In one of the most intense days of questioning, Ajayi was confronted with images of the evidence recovered from his home. Each item presented to him chipped away at his denials. When shown photos of Mackenzie's personal belongings, his expression betrayed him. Detectives watched closely, noting every flinch, every momentary break in his mask of calm. Forensic experts had provided conclusive links between Ajayi and the crime scene, and with each piece, his defense crumbled further. Despite Ajayi's increasingly fragile demeanor, he continued to assert his innocence, but the evidence was undeniable. The findings in his backyard, the bloodstains hidden under the basement carpet, the chilling remnants of his internet searches, each piece added to the grim mosaic of his guilt. As the hours wore on, the interrogation room grew colder, the weight of the evidence pressing down on everyone present. By the end of the session, detectives left convinced that they had cornered a man who could no longer escape the truth. Yet, as they exited the room, they knew their work was far from over. The puzzle they had painstakingly constructed was nearly complete, but there was still one crucial piece missing: the full account of what had led Mackenzie to those final fateful hours in Ajayi's presence. Only when that piece was uncovered could justice truly be served for Mackenzie Lueck. The painstaking investigation into Mackenzie Lueck's death had revealed much, but there was still a shadow over the exact sequence of events that led to the tragedy. Investigators were now piecing together a clearer picture, using every piece of evidence, forensic analysis, and witness account to reconstruct the moments that had unfolded after she stepped into the darkness of Hatch Park. It was in the solitude of Ajayi's home that the full horror began to emerge. Detectives theorized that Mackenzie had likely been led into the house under false pretenses. Her texts to him prior to the meeting had shown no signs of unease, suggesting she had no reason to believe she was in danger. But once inside, the welcoming facade gave way to the sinister intentions Ajayi had carefully hidden. In the basement, cold, stark, and designed to isolate, Mackenzie likely realized the situation was far from what she expected. Forensic evidence suggested there was a struggle. Blood spatter patterns and disturbed furniture told a story of resistance. Mackenzie, known to be strong-willed and resilient, appeared to have fought back with everything she had. But Ajayi's advantage in strength and preparation ultimately left her vulnerable. As forensic specialists analyzed the evidence, they noted the tools and items recovered from the scene. The handcuffs and duct tape hinted at a grim intent, items that seemed to strip away any doubt about premeditation. The traces of adhesive on Mackenzie's wrists and the abrasions on her skin confirmed her desperate attempt to escape. Witness accounts from neighbors added a chilling layer to the timeline. One neighbor remembered seeing lights in Ajayi's backyard late into the night. Yaw. Another recalled hearing faint, muffled sounds, but nothing that raised immediate alarm. These seemingly insignificant observations now carried a devastating weight. providing a timeline for when Mackenzie's life was taken. In the following hours, Ajayi set about erasing any evidence of what had occurred. He dragged Mackenzie's body to his backyard, where he attempted to destroy all traces of the crime. The fire pit became the centerpiece of this effort, flames consuming personal belongings and evidence as the night wore on. Investigators later determined that he had returned to this site multiple times in the days that followed, adding to the fire to ensure the evidence was obliterated. But what Ajayi didn't account for was the resilience of forensic science. Even after the intense heat of the flames, fragments remained, fragments that told a story. Specialists uncovered charred fabric, small bone fragments, and pieces of jewelry, each tying Mackenzie back to the place she had fought to survive. The psychological profile of Ajayi painted an unsettling picture. Experts who reviewed his behavior and past interactions described a man driven by control and power, someone who viewed others as tools for his gratification. His fascination with crime stories and methods of avoiding detection suggested a deep-seated obsession with the idea of superiority over others, as though he believed he could commit the perfect crime. What stood out most to detectives was the cold detachment with which he carried out the aftermath. Ajayi's attempts to clean the crime scene, replacing carpet, scrubbing floors, and methodically hiding evidence showed a chilling lack of remorse. Neighbors who saw him in the days after Mackenzie's disappearance reported that he acted as though nothing had happened, engaging in casual conversations and going about his daily routines. The forensic team noted that the fire pit, a critical piece of evidence, had been used multiple times before the night of the crime. Ajayi's behavior suggested this wasn't an impulsive act, but rather one he had contemplated long before Mackenzie ever walked into Hatch Park. As detectives unraveled the chilling details, they knew that the evidence in their hands was more than enough to bring charges. The picture they had assembled was grim, but clear, a testament to the thoroughness of their work and the resilience of Mackenzie's loved ones, who had pushed tirelessly for answers. But even as the case moved toward its final stages, one truth remained. Mackenzie's life was so much more than the crime that had taken her away. Her story was one of resilience, warmth, and promise, a life stolen too soon by the cruelty of a man who had allowed darkness to consume him. As the case against Ayoola Ajayi moved into the courtroom, the weight of the evidence bore down like a crushing tide. The trial became a public spectacle, drawing attention not only for its disturbing details, but also for the sheer tragedy of what it represented. Mackenzie Lueck, a vibrant young woman with a promising future, had become the victim of a calculated and senseless act of violence. The prosecution opened their case with a detailed presentation of the evidence gathered during the investigation. Jurors were shown photographs of the crime scene, the charred remnants of Mackenzie's belongings, and the bloodstains uncovered in Ajayi's home. Each piece of evidence painted an unflinchingly grim picture, one that left no room for ambiguity about his involvement. Testimonies from forensic experts bolstered the prosecution's case. They explained how DNA evidence linked Mackenzie to Ajayi's basement and backyard, and how the fire pit had been used in an attempt to destroy critical evidence. The specialists described how even the most minute traces could survive such efforts, allowing investigators to piece together the horrifying truth. But the most compelling moments came from those who knew Mackenzie best. Her friends and family took the stand, sharing stories of her warmth, intelligence, and humor. They spoke of her dreams, her dedication to her studies, and the many lives she had touched. Each testimony served as a reminder of the life that had been stolen, grounding the trial in the human cost of the crime. Ajayi's defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. His attorneys attempted to cast doubt on the timeline and the interpretation of the forensic findings, but their efforts fell flat in the face of the prosecution's airtight case. When Ajayi himself took the stand, his demeanor shifted between indifference and defensiveness, further alienating the jury. His attempt to explain away the evidence only deepened the sense of unease. He claimed he had nothing to do with Mackenzie's death and offered vague explanations for the incriminating findings at his home. But his responses were evasive, and his calm exterior cracked under cross-examination. The prosecutors' pointed questions revealed inconsistencies in his story, exposing his lies to the jury. As the trial progressed, the community's grief transformed into a demand for justice. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs and photos of Mackenzie. Her story had become a rallying cry, a call to protect others from similar harm. The trial culminated in closing arguments that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The prosecution laid out the evidence one final time, methodically dismantling the defense's arguments and presenting an undeniable narrative of premeditation and violence. They described Ajay as a man who thrived on control and manipulation, whose actions were not just cruel, but calculated. When the jury retired to deliberate, the weight of the case hung heavy in the air. Hours passed, then a day, as the jurors sifted through the mountain of evidence and testimony. Finally, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all charges. Ajay showed little reaction as the decision was read aloud, but for Mackenzie's family and friends, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it could never bring back the daughter, friend, and classmate they had lost. In the weeks following the trial, Mackenzie's story remained in the public eye. Her family used the platform to advocate for greater awareness of online safety, hoping to spare others from similar tragedies. They worked with local organizations to create scholarships in her name, ensuring that her legacy would live on in the lives of others. For the detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case, the resolution was a testament to their dedication and to Mackenzie herself. Her life had been stolen, but her story had brought people together in a collective fight for justice, a fight that would not be forgotten. And as the world moved forward, Mackenzie Lueck's name became a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the light she had brought to the world, and of the strength her loved ones showed in the face of unimaginable loss. If these stories left you reflecting on the importance of safety and the fragility of life, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We're here with new stories every day. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons do you think these cases teach us, and how can we work to create a safer world? Thank you for watching, and remember, staying aware and vigilant can make all the difference. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.